Good afternoon. I'm Scott Turner. I'm the Community Affairs Officer from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all here this afternoon to hear about David Erickson's latest work, The Housing Policy Revolution, Networks and Neighborhoods. First, I want to thank everyone for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I know that's hard, and I also want to apologize for having it on the cusp of Yom Kippur, although I suspect that's the reason the room was available this afternoon. I also want to give my sincere thanks to the Board of Governors for hosting this event. We collaborate with them a lot, and in fact, we've hosted events with them in this very room. But it was extremely gracious of them to invite us to have this event here this afternoon, and I really want to thank them. You all have the agenda. We're going to have David speak first for 25 minutes, and then we have a distinguished panel of 4 experts who are going to come up right away and take their seats and immediately follow him with 5 to 8 minutes of reactions and comments about his book. Then the panel will stay there. David will jump back up, and we'll have a Q&A session and engage both with David and the audience. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce the panelists now, so we won't interrupt the flow. We'll just have them come up and start right away after David finishes. But the first panelist is going to be Brad Hunt, who is Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And Brad's most recent work is a history of the Chicago Housing Authority called Blueprint for Disaster. Brad will be followed by Ellen Seidman, who's Senior Fellow and Financial Services Policy Director at the New America Foundation. Ellen's a frequent collaborator of ours and is also EVP at Shore Bank in her spare time. Ellen will be followed by Robert Pullman, who's Executive Director of the Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development, which is a group based here in D.C. of 125 nonprofits who I assume operated in the vast network that David describes so eloquently in his book. And then finally we'll hear from Alan Bruby, who's Senior Fellow and Research Director for the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. Alan's a good friend of ours and actually collaborated with all 12 Reserve Banks on an opus on concentrated poverty in America that took several years longer, I think, than he had ever expected. So he deserves some sort of reward for that. Now for the fun part, introducing David. So I first met David 4.5 years ago when I was filling the second of 2 PhD positions I was given to build a research function in my department. Now, those of you who know the Fed know that really in the Fed there's only one academic discipline, economics. And I'd already hired one PhD who has her PhD in human geography, which was already pushing the envelope. So in walks David, and I'm looking at his resume. He has substantial experience in deal making in affordable housing. He had master's in public policy from my alma mater, so of course I like that. Then I look, he has a PhD in history, and I thought, what the heck is the Fed going to think of that? But needless to say, he won us over quickly, and even more quickly proved himself an invaluable asset, not only to our bank, but to the whole Federal Reserve System. And he did that by first creating and launching a brand new journal, the Community Development Investment Review. He did that by establishing a new working paper series that gives voice to policymakers and academics and practitioners and does what he likes to say he does, which is bring ideas to people who get things done. And he's done that by overseeing a number of initiatives that exploring secondary market access for community development assets, to delving into peer-to-peer lending platforms to increase capital, to most recently commissioning a working paper and having an event right here in this room a few months ago exploring the crisis in community development finance. And somehow in the middle of all that, he wrote a book. So I'll leave it to David himself and to the panelists to really explore the book. But suffice to say, we think it not only adds considerably to the literature on affordable housing, but just as importantly, and on a personal level, we think it really gives a blueprint to those of us in community affairs in the Federal Reserve System in terms of trying to help build those local coalitions and networks that David talks about, and ultimately trying to address the challenges facing our disadvantaged communities. I should also mention the books for sale over there in the corner by the Urban Institute Press, and I'm sure David would sign a copy if you bought one. But with no further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague and my good friend, David Erickson.